Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 475. I'm the host Kyle Anzalone, and today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Happy to have you back on the show today. We got a lot to talk about, of course. I just want to remind people they can find the show and all of our work at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, or articles we write end up in the news section of that website. You can find everything that we put out, at least with the show, on YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee, or anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. Follow the show at con_interest on Twitter, or you can find it at either mine or Connor's social medias, anywhere they are. And with that, Connor, I got a few stories to talk about today before I hand it over to you. First up here today, State Department confirms U.S. citizen Gonzo Lira is detained in Ukraine. So the State Department has confirmed that American citizen Gonzo Lira has been held at the Ukrainian prison over charges related to his speech and views on the war in Ukraine. Lira is a popular YouTuber and journalist who was arrested by the Ukrainian security services in May for creating content that was critical of the Ukrainian government and explaining how the Russia-Ukraine war was provoked. He was charged over claims that he justified the Russian invasion. Lira, who is also a citizen of Chile, reappeared on social media in July when he posted a video and Twitter thread saying that he was released on bail and was attempting to cross the border into Hungary. He alleged that he was tortured while in Ukrainian prison and said he will not be heard from again if he was recaptured. It meant, he was captured by Ukrainian authorities. The State Department spokesperson told Breitbart News on Tuesday, "We are aware of the detention of Mr. Lira in Ukraine. We take our role assisting U.S. citizens abroad seriously, and we are providing all appropriate assistance." Now, Connor, this seems absolutely insane to me because this is a government that we've given $100 billion to over the past year, and you would think that that would probably be enough to get Lira freed from the Ukrainian jail and sent back to Chile or the U.S., but that does not appear to be happening. All right, Connor, some big news on the war in Ukraine. Poland says it no longer arming Ukraine amid grain spat. So the Polish prime minister said Wednesday that Poland is no longer arming Ukraine, marking a significant shift as Warsaw has been a staunch supporter of the NATO proxy war with Russia. The prime minister's comments came amid a spat between Warsaw and Kiev over a Polish ban on Ukrainian grain. When asked if the dispute would impact Polish support for Ukraine, the prime minister said, "We are no longer transferring weapons to Ukraine because we are now arming Poland with more modern weapons." And I've covered on the show quite a bit in the past couple of weeks, Connor, about Poland's major military buildup. They hope to have the largest land army in Europe by 2025, buying billions of dollars of HIMARS, Apache helicopters, and Abrams tanks. And so, I mean, this is interesting because throughout the war, Poland has been one of the most, staunch supporters of Ukraine, but even more so, has really put a lot of pressure on other Western countries to provide more arms and aids to Ukraine, Connor. I mean, if you remember the Leopard tanks and the package of modern battle tanks that went to Ukraine, Poland played a huge part, if not, the leading role in getting Germany to sign off on sending Leopard tanks to Ukraine, which, ended up the UK saying their Challenger tanks and the Americans agreeing to send their Abrams tanks, which should be arriving there sometime this week. So this is really interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if in a couple weeks or even a shorter period of time, Washington bribes Warsaw and Kiev into resolving this spat somehow, whether that means like subsidies for Poland's grain industry or something like that, or, just kind of reading Zelensky the riot act and telling him to, put out a bunch of statements about how grateful they are for their Polish partners and how critical they have been in trying to, butter Warsaw up and to gain them to allow it. Now, one other important note here, Connor, is this is just the Polish arms, and Poland is still going to allow NATO to funnel arms through Poland into Ukraine. So this is interesting, Connor. Report nets arms package for Ukraine to include more cluster bombs, but no ATACMS. So President Biden said he will announce a new arms package for Ukraine when President Zelensky visits Washington on Thursday. So that should be happening today, Connor. And my guess is that Dave's reporting here is probably correct, although, sometimes the details change a little bit much. So if the packages for more or less or something like that, we'll see. But we're expecting it to be $325 billion and will include a second tranche of the widely banned cluster munitions in the form of 105 millimeter artillery shells. And of course, this is something else we've been talking about a lot on the show, the lack of artillery shells in the West, relying on the cluster bombs in response. All right. G7 officials say Ukraine war could last for more than 7 years. The U.S. and its allies in the Group of Seven are preparing to support the proxy war in Ukraine for years to come, Bloomberg reported on Tuesday. One unnamed official from a European G7 nation told the paper that it could last 6 or 7 more years and that allies need to prepare financially to keep fueling the conflict for the long run. I'm not going to go through all of this, Connor, because this is something, again, that we've talked a lot about on the show in the past week, but this is just another official saying it. And so, we now have a Czech general, Austin, Milley, the top American defense officials, a top NATO defense official, and now another official from a European country. So I guess we're looking at 7 years of war if we don't all start nuking each other before that. All right, Connor, next up here, an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Zelensky slams UN at Security Council meeting, demands Moscow lose veto power. Zelensky attacked the UN as ineffective and unable to enforce its own principles. The Ukrainian leader called for Russia to lose its veto power on a speech during the Security Council meeting. So Zelensky was speaking at a special session of the UNSC, that's the UN Security Council, and that is the most powerful body in the UN. And Zelensky said the organization had failed to uphold its values. This is his quote: Ukrainian soldiers are now doing at the expense of their blood what the UN Security Council should be doing by voting. They're stopping the aggression and upholding the principles of the UN Charter. He wanted to call for Russia to be punished for invading Ukraine by removing Moscow's veto power at the United Nations Security Council. The Ukrainian leader added that removing Russia's veto power was a necessary step because all efforts are vetoed by the aggressor. The US, UK, France, China, and Russia are the 5 permanent members of the UNSC and can veto any resolution that comes to the floor of the body. It is unusual for a leader of a country not on the UNSC, which Ukraine is not, to speak at a session. The Russian ambassador to the body objected to Zelensky speaking, but he was allowed to proceed with his address. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did not arrive at the session until after the Ukrainian leader exited, which was apparently a big disappointment to all the UN beat writers in the West who were apparently hoping for some, I don't know, maybe Lavrov and Zelensky to trade blows, but they were really hoping for some kind of clash to occur, and the two were never in the room at the same time, which, for all of us is probably better off. Diplomacy is a good thing. Arguments are bad. All right. So to finish up here, Zelensky went on to condemn the UN for failing to resolve the aggression, saying we should recognize that the UN finds itself in a deadlock on matters of aggression. Humankind can no longer pin its hopes on the UN. However, Connor, in the early months of the war, the UN and Turkey led a round of talks that nearly resulted in a deal where the Russian military would withdraw from Ukraine. Then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson traveled to Kiev and pressured Zelensky to walk away from the negotiations with Russia. Subsequently, the Turkish foreign minister explained why the talks failed. He said there were countries within NATO that want the war in Ukraine to continue. They see the continuation of the war as weakening Russia. They don't care much about the situation in Ukraine. And so, why Zelensky wants to slam the UN, it's not completely justified because the UN did try to end this war pretty early on. All right, another article I wrote yesterday, the Ukrainian Main Directorate of Intelligence, the HUR, is claiming they carried out a sabotage attack on a key Russian military base just miles from Moscow. And basically what I point out in this article, Connor, is the evidence is very questionable. In fact, if anybody's watching the show here, this is the evidence that Ukraine put forward saying that there was a successful attack. And if you look at the screen, all these planes look capable of flying to me. So I'm very skeptical of the Ukrainian claims. If it did happen, this could result in a major escalation in the war, though. And there are reports that Russia is carrying out some pretty heavy missile attacks across Ukraine today. While the HUR says that the Russian GRU is investigating this, Russia hasn't put out any statements confirming or denying this attack. All right, Connor, last story I have today. Pretty much all week I've been covering what's happening at the UN. And so hopefully this is my last one because these speeches tend to get a little dry. But this one from Ibrahim Raisi, the Iranian president, I thought was pretty interesting and really warranted being covered because the mainstream media was, kind of conveying this story incorrectly, where they're saying that Iran is urging Biden to return to the UN, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. What he's really saying is that Washington either needs to commit to returning to the deal or walk away from it, and that, Iran has other options in the world. So, speaking in New York on Tuesday at the United Nations, Raisi urged Biden to show that he would like to return the Iran nuclear deal, or abandon it. He said the U.S. should demonstrate in a verifiable fashion that it wants to return to the 2015 nuclear deal, adding Washington must choose the path, either JCPOA or not. Raisi explained that Iran was within full compliance of the agreement when then President Donald Trump exited the deal in 2018 and reimposed sanctions on Tehran that were lifted under the JCPOA. The UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, confirmed that Iran was fully complying with the terms of the JCPOA. After Trump initiated an economic war on Tehran aimed at destroying the Iranian economy, the Islamic Republic started to walk back its commitments to the JCPOA, including exceeding caps on enrichment and limiting the inspections of its nuclear facilities. Raisi noted in his speech that Tehran has a right to have a peaceful nuclear energy program, and Iran has no nuclear weapons program. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran is a member of, it is stated that all countries have a right to a nuclear energy program. During Biden's address to the UN, he claimed that Washington was taking active steps to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. He promised to remain steadfast in our commitment that Iran must never acquire nuclear weapons. However, the U.S. Department of Defense states in its nuclear posture review that Iran does not possess a nuclear weapon, and we currently believe it is not pursuing one. In his speech, Raisi argued that the world has reached a critical juncture as Washington's domination over the globe is waning. He said the global landscape is undergoing a paradigm shift towards an emerging international order, a trajectory that is not reversible. As the non-Western powers have emerged, there is a collective hope for a novel and equitable world order. The Islamic Republic of Iran advocates for maximum economic and political convergence and is interested in interacting with the global community under the principle of justice. As Biden has continued Trump's economic war against Iran, Tehran has found an increasing number of partners on the world stage. Iran recently inked a deal with Saudi Arabia that was brokered by China that has seen Tehran and Riyadh start to normalize ties. Additionally, Tehran became a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS Plus. Both of those organizations include nearly half of the world's population and at least a third of the world economy. Raisi went on to slam Washington for the prolonged war in Ukraine. He said the United States of America has fanned the flames of violence in Ukraine to weaken European countries. He added that rejecting any ceasefire plan in the Ukraine war by the Americans showed that America has a long-term plan to weaken Europe. And Connor, he's absolutely right about the U.S. undermining talks in every case. And, we already talked about that earlier in the war. But just recently, before the counteroffensive began, past November, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, was saying that Ukraine should negotiate. And we had our Secretary of State, our top diplomat, Antony Blinken, saying no need for a ceasefire, war going on at full speed. So the Iranian leader speaking some truth there. And, I don't want to glorify the man too much because I know that Iran isn't a particularly liberal country. And, as Mohammed Sahimi points out in a recent very good article at the Quincy Institute. Look, there are reasons that the Iranian people need to protest against their government to try to get more rights and more freedoms. But anything that the Americans do to try to encourage that by sanctioning Iran or threatening the Iranian leaders is completely counterproductive and does the exact opposite. And so not to praise Raisi too much, but, he is speaking some truth about how the world stage is changing. And of course, Iran really understands that because it's been one of the most sanctioned countries by the U.S., over the past decade or so. And the changing world order has opened a lot of doors for Iran. And with that, Connor, let me hand it over to you to talk about this prisoner swap that I think I mentioned on the show last week, saying that it could come this weekend. It turns out it happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just say about the Raisi thing. It's fun watching Fox Business hosts having to report on that speech and having to go, where is he getting this stuff about thwarting negotiations and opportunities for peace? But so, yes, so this is stories from Dave DeCamp on September 18th. 5 Americans released as part of the prisoner swap deal with Iran. This is probably the best thing the Biden administration has done so far. It might be the only good thing they've done in terms of foreign policy. So we have 5 Iranian Americans arrived in Qatar on Monday after being released by Iranian authorities as part of a prisoner swap deal between Washington and Tehran that was mediated by Doha and unfroze $6 billion in Iranian funds. The 5 Americans were greeted by U.S. and Qatari officials and given a brief medical check before boarding a government plane headed for Washington. In exchange for Iran releasing the Americans, the U.S. released 5 Iranians and dropped the charges against them. They had been charged with ostensibly violating sanctions. 2 of the released Iranians also arrived in Qatar on Monday and are headed to Iran. According to the Iranian Foreign Ministry, the other 3 are not returning to Iran. 1 will join his family in a third country, and 2 actually decided to stay in the United States. So according to Iran's press TV, Iran's central bank chief said that the $6 billion in Iranian oil revenue that the U.S. agreed to release is now in Qatar. The money was transferred from South Korea, where it was frozen in 2018 when the U.S. Tore up the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and reimposed sanctions. And the prisoner swap suggests that there may be more room for diplomatic maneuvering between Washington and Tehran on a new nuclear deal. Although a Biden administration official, of course, downplayed this, saying to NBC News, if we see an opportunity, we will explore it. But right now, I've really nothing to talk about it. In another sign that the U.S. isn't interested in diplomacy with Iran, the U.S. issued dozens of new sanctions on Iran at the end of last week. And, just in the in order to, for the sake of being optimistic, they really can't say that, oh, this does mean that we could potentially come up with something here on the nuclear issue, because they're already taking so much heat just for doing this prisoner swap. The mere fact that they're unfreezing billions of dollars in Iranian funds is like a cardinal sin in American politics today, where unless if you want to nuke Iran, that's more permissible than unfreezing some of their money. Besides, extending New START, this is probably the only good thing that Biden has done. And I'm glad to see that the Iranians and the Americans have been released. And I do think that there is an opportunity for an interim nuclear deal to be made. The one that Malley was negotiating before he got sidelined and kicked off his post seemed to be pretty reasonable. All they had to do was really stop enriching uranium at 60%, or just decrease the amount of their stockpile of uranium hexafluoride enriched to 60%, which they've already been doing per some of these IAEA reports that have been reported on in the media. And they just had to maintain a transparent relationship with the IAEA. And I think essentially that's what they've been doing. And so and they would have seen billions more in Iranian funds unfrozen. But for right now, this is probably about as far as we're going to get. The U.S., again, added even more sanctions. In this next story that I wrote for the Institute, the U.S. levied sanctions over Iran's drone program. So, you get a little, and then, of course, they have to show that they're still tough. So, Washington imposed sanctions on 4 entities and 7 people in Russia, China, and Turkey over their alleged assistance with Tehran's drone program, which the U.S. says has significantly benefited Russia in its war with Ukraine. This is one I wrote for the Institute on September 19th. So, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi has denounced the accusations that Tehran has been arming Moscow since the Kremlin launched its invasion last year. They don't deny, they did it first, but Iran doesn't deny that they've sold quite a bit of drones to Russia, but none, they say, since the war actually began. And so, or this phase of the war, since Putin's invasion last February. And the sanctions announced by the Treasury Department on Tuesday target the Iranian drone company, Aircraft Manufacturing Industrial Company, which is also known as HESA, H-E-S-A, which was hit with sanctions in 2008 as well, along with its managing executives. So additionally, a Chinese tech company, 2 Turkish money exchangers, and a group of Russian parts manufacturing companies were hit with sanctions. So Brian E. Nelson, the Treasury's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, said Iran's continued deliberate proliferation of UAVs enables Russia and its proxies in the Middle East and other destabilizing actors to undermine global stability. State Department spokesman Matthew Miller declared the Washington will continue to use every tool at its disposal to disrupt these efforts and work with its allies and partners to hold Iran accountable for its actions in Ukraine. However, while meeting with media executives on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Raisi explained Iran is against the war in Ukraine. And Raisi reiterated Tehran's offer to mediate peace talks between the two sides, and he emphasized that his nation's strong ties with Russia include defense cooperation, yes, but he insisted that there have been no weapons transfers since Ukraine was invaded last February. He said, if they have a document that Iran gave weapons or drones to the Russians after the war, then they should produce it. So Moscow has officially denied that Iran's drones are being used by Russian forces against Ukraine. In June, U.S. intelligence officials accused Tehran of assisting Moscow in building a drone manufacturing plant that may be operational next year. And earlier in the war, Iran was actually relaying messages back and forth between Moscow and Kiev. Got to the point where even a top Western European leader, who is believed to be French President Emmanuel Macron, actually gave Tehran a proposal for a peace initiative in Ukraine last year. Subsequently, Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian then presented it to Sergei Lavrov, his Russian counterpart. But after this whole controversy with the drones, which are said to be Iranian, after that, last fall, Mikhailo Podolyak, one of Zelensky's top advisors, threatened to go to war with Iran and called for a total embargo on the country along with military strikes. For Iran's part, in November, Amir Abdollahian said that a meeting was actually planned where Ukraine was supposed to have disclosed evidence to the Iranian side that their drones were in fact being used to attack Ukraine. But the deal was sabotaged. So, quote, we had such an appointment 2 weeks ago in a European country. A military and political delegation went to that European country, but unfortunately, at the last minute, the Ukrainian delegation did not attend due to pressure from the U.S. and some European countries, in particular Germany. Amir Abdollahian told reporters this. And since then, Zelensky has asked the Ukrainian parliament to sanction Iran for at least half a century. And, it's interesting, too, just the hypocrisy is always, of course, the U.S. is, because of this proxy war, Ukraine is the most heavily mined country on the planet. Who knows when that's ever going to be, all of that's going to be cleaned up and how many civilians are going to die in the interim, let alone with all the cluster bomblets that are going to be killing people for decades into the future. The depleted uranium, which, if it's anything like Fallujah, will be nightmarish for generations, the birth defects and cancers that are going to run rampant. And, to talk about the proxies in the Middle East, our proxies commit genocides. And if you even want to just talk about the UAV, the Israelis' rhetoric is always, Iran's UAV terror. The Iranians are drone striking Iran. We've covered that for years on the show. And so, but that doesn't get talked about as much. You'll see, you can find it in mainstream news. They'll just, Israel just carried out another drone strike in Iran. But, Iran is supposed to be the great Satan. They're the ones with the drones that kill good people, I guess. So, anyway, it's just they seem desperate here, and they've laid so many sanctions on Iran, and they just had this deal, obviously to release the prisoners, and I think they really did have a chance here with the interim deal. It's very disappointing, but we're just going to see more sanctions laid out, and of course, we're looking toward these major military drills that the U.S. and Israel are going to carry out here pretty soon, where they're going to be jointly practicing bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. So, on the one hand, I think they can't talk about any positive developments publicly because they'll be maligned for it. But at the same time, I think that White House official speaking to, or that administration official speaking to NBC News is probably actually telling the truth more than he isn't, or more than he's just trying to cover up for the sake of covering their right flank. Okay, so this next story from Dave DeCamp. U.S. discusses mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia similar to Japan and South Korea. We've got to get Israel's relations normalized with all these different countries in the Middle East. That's the most important thing. That's the top of the agenda. So U.S. and Saudi officials are discussing the terms of a potential mutual defense treaty that would be similar to the pacts the U.S. has with South Korea and Japan, the New York Times reported on Tuesday. The discussions are part of a U.S. effort to broker a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Riyadh's main demands for normalization is for stronger security guarantees for the U.S. and help in establishing a nuclear program. So unnamed U.S. officials told the Times that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman regards a mutual defense agreement with the U.S., quote, as the most important element in his talks with the Biden administration about Israel. Such an agreement would likely involve the U.S. and Saudi Arabia pledging to provide military support if the other is attacked on Saudi territory or elsewhere in the Middle East. The comparison to the U.S. pacts in East Asia suggests that it could lead to a more robust U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia, and that's never gotten us into trouble before, as there are tens of thousands of U.S. troops stationed in Japan and South Korea. Now, however, U.S. officials told the Times that there are no serious discussions about establishing a large contingent. There are no serious discussions at the moment about establishing a large contingent of American troops in Saudi Arabia under the potential deal. According to the notification to Congress in June, there are currently about 2,700 U.S. troops stationed in the kingdom. Now, while the Saudis are making demands of the U.S. as a condition for normalization with Tel Aviv, there are signs a deal likely won't be reached anytime soon. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Friday said a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal remains a difficult proposition. And then 2 days later, the Saudi newspaper El Paf recently reported that Riyadh is pulled out of the negotiations, but the claim was denied by the State Department and denied by Israel. And then I'll get to it here in a moment, but it's now been personally refuted by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So if the U.S. does pursue a mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia, it would risk escalating the war in Yemen, where a de facto ceasefire between the Saudis and the Houthis has been held since April of 2022. And there have been no Saudi airstrikes in Yemen or Houthi attacks inside Saudi Arabia since then, but a lasting peace deal or political settlement has not been signed, meaning the war could reignite. So the U.S.-backed Saudi-led war on Yemen had a devastating toll on civilians due to targeting of civilians and infrastructure and the blockade on the country, which has not been fully lifted. News of the Biden administration discussing the East Asia model for a Saudi mutual defense pact comes after a Human Rights Watch report said that Saudi border forces were killing hundreds of Ethiopian migrants, including in brutal fashion. Okay, so now this story I wrote yesterday for the Institute, Netanyahu and MBS suggest progress is being made on U.S. brokered normalization deal. So I thought I'm surprised to see how enthusiastic MBS is, or at least he was in this interview with Brett Baer yesterday on Fox News. But Netanyahu met with Biden, and so they're both talking up this project. And so Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman are expressing confidence in this deal that Biden's administration is, as I said, seems to be their top priority when it comes to certainly when it comes to the Middle East. And I think they really need a diplomatic win here before they as we head toward the election. And this comes as Netanyahu's apartheid army is, of course, murdering scores of Palestinians in the occupied territories in the blockaded Gaza Strip. In fact, on Tuesday, we'll get to this in a moment, they killed 6 Palestinians. 4 in the Jenin refugee camp, 1 in Jericho, and they actually killed another Palestinian in Gaza. And so Netanyahu met with President Joe Biden on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly on Wednesday. And this was the first meeting the two heads of state have held since the former returned to power last December. The White House is striving to forge the deal between the two regional powers. Supporters of the deal say that it will be a major diplomatic win heading into election season. Riyadh is perceived as the gateway to Israel's acceptance in the broader Muslim world. This is Tom Friedman speaking. And the administration believes this deal can be exploited to also curtail China's influence. This is one of the main this is a big part of what's animating the Biden administration too. And so Netanyahu told Biden, I guess, prior to their talks, that I think under your leadership, Mr. President, we can forge a historic peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The prime minister continued, I think such a peace would go a long way, first to advance the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, achieve reconciliation between the Islamic world and the Jewish state, and advance a genuine peace between Israel and the Palestinians. This is something within our reach. So this meeting comes less than 24 hours after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinians, mostly in the West Bank. As I said, 4, including 4 in the Jenin refugee camp, which in July, with the support of the Biden administration, Israeli forces invaded and bombed, where a dozen people were killed, including 5 children. Israeli bulldozers tore up the camp's roads, its water and electricity networks. 1,000 troops participated in that raid, along with Apache helicopters, drones, and 150 armored vehicles. Israeli massacres and war crimes, such as the July raid on Jenin, have made normalization with Tel Aviv increasingly unpopular in the region, including among the citizenry in Arab states which are already signatories to the Abraham Accords, such as Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. And that's those stats come from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is literally the Israel lobby's think tank. So it might even be worse than they're saying. Biden said, you've heard me say many times, were there no Israel, we'd have to invent one. And I mean it, Biden said, after calling Netanyahu a friend. This year, Israel has been constantly destabilizing the region, including by doubling its nearly weekly airstrikes in Syria, carrying out drone strikes in Iran, and launching a brutal bombing campaign against Gaza, an open-air prison which killed at least 33 people. They even bombed Lebanon earlier this year. So according to Middle East Eye, this year is shaping up to be one of the bloodiest in the occupied West Bank. At least 222 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces this year, including 38 children. A total of 185 people have died in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and another 37 people have been killed in the Gaza Strip. Additionally, David Barnea, chief of the Israeli Mossad, has boasted that Tel Aviv will soon be initiating yet another assassination campaign, quote, deep inside Iran, in the heart of Tehran. Now, some Saudi officials say Riyadh is holding out for a two-state solution in Palestine, a la the Arab peace plan, which calls for a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with East Jerusalem as its capital. Though there was a report in Arabic media over the weekend suggesting Riyadh had pulled out of the normalization talks over concerns regarding Netanyahu's far-right ruling coalition, which is bent on annexing the entire West Bank, the report was personally refuted by MBS during an interview with Fox News on Wednesday. So in the same interview, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia is asked if Tel Aviv and Riyadh are close to a deal, and MBS responds by saying, every day we get closer. Now, per the New York Times, Washington is currently discussing, we already covered this, the mutual security treaty akin to the pacts with Seoul and Tokyo. And and just as far as the Palestinian situation goes, the PA is attempting to secure certain concessions related to Area C of the West Bank, but there is just no discussion at all of an independent Palestinian state. So, I mean, and it's very disappointing to see all this. I mean, also MBS, it's worth noting, said this has made a few headlines that we would have to get a nuclear weapon if Iran does. And maybe he's, I think it's Iran has put up with a lot without going for nuclear weapons or chemical weapons. I mean, it's haram. Both Ayatollahs have forbidden it, of course, ever since the Iran-Iraq war. But and of course, they've pledged not to increase enrichment beyond 60%. And they've been signatories in the Non-Proliferation Treaty for more than 50 years. That said, if it really gets down to the wire and the U.S. and Israel are starting a war, they could attempt to build a nuclear bomb. And there's nothing's that's not necessarily outside the realm of possibility. However, I don't think MBS having normalized relations with Iran earlier this year is that concerned that that's going to happen. And he knows Israel has probably hundreds of nuclear weapons. And I think this is more or less just a way of, really pushing for assistance in building his nuclear energy program from the United States, and also that security guarantee. So it's all politics, of course, and part of the negotiation. But yeah, it looks like all parties are really kind of gung ho on getting this deal accomplished. So of course, the Palestinians are going to get the shaft as usual. But yeah, and so, I mean, this is the worst thing Biden could do right now, especially with regards to Yemen, is to give them this security guarantee when they should be active. He should already have pledged, and Congress should be forcing him to do this, that we will never support Saudi Arabia militarily if fighting resumes, or with intelligence or any. We wouldn't give them any kind of support in the event that the fighting resumes with the Houthis. But that's not what Biden's going to do, because that would screw this up. So, and Israel takes a much higher priority. So, okay, so now on to Yemen. This story is about these talks that were just held in Saudi Arabia with a Houthi delegation. So Houthis leave Saudi Arabia after 5 days of talks on potential peace deal. This is by Dave DeCamp from September 19th. So negotiators representing Yemen's Houthis left Saudi Arabia on Tuesday after 5 days of talks aimed at reaching an agreement to end the 8-year conflict between the two parties. No deals were signed after the talks, but the two sources told Reuters that some progress was made on the main sticking points between the two sides, which includes a timeline for foreign troops exiting Yemen and the payment of Yemeni government's employees' salaries. The negotiations also focused on the full lifting of the blockade on Houthi-controlled ports and the Sana'a airport. And the sources told Reuters that more talks are expected after consultation soon. And the talks marked the first time the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition intervened in Yemen in 2015 that a Houthi delegation traveled to Saudi Arabia. The peace talks are being mediated by Oman and built on meetings that were held in April, back when a Saudi delegation visited Houthi-controlled territory for the first time. Now, while there's been fighting on the ground, a de facto ceasefire between the Saudis and the Houthis has held relatively well since April of last year. And in that time, as we mentioned earlier, there haven't been any Saudi airstrikes or cross-border Houthi attacks, retaliatory attacks inside Saudi. But until a lasting deal is agreed to and the blockade is fully lifted, there's always the risk of escalation. And the U.S.-backed war on Yemen, of course, has been devastating for civilians, with the blockade and the frequent bombing of civilian infrastructure. According to the UN, at the end of 2021, at least 377 people have been killed by the war. More than half of the deaths were due to preventable disease and starvation caused by the siege. And the majority of these deaths are children, infants and children under 5 years old. So, obviously, like I said, I think that the Progressive Caucus in the House actually had a plan that they were going to put forward some sort of a resolution that would demand that Biden would commit to refrain from offering Saudi Arabia any support if there was any fighting. But as I said, I mean, they can't do it right now politically, with their priority being getting Israel recognized by every different dictatorship they can in the region. That's so much more important to Biden and Blinken and Sullivan and these guys. So it's terribly unfortunate, but hopefully the Houthis and the Saudis can work it out. And so that the blockade can be lifted and the war can be ended before that becomes, because it would just be the absolute worst thing to get this war started again. But now moving on to Syria. So Bashar al-Assad has traveled to China in his first visit to the country, I believe, since 2004. So this is from the Cradle, the news desk at the Cradle. So China says the current visit to the country by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad would take bilateral ties between the two nations to a quote new level. We believe that President Bashar al-Assad's visit will further deepen mutual political trust and cooperation in various fields between the two countries, pushing bilateral ties to a new level, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning told reporters on Thursday morning. Quote, since the establishment of diplomatic relations 67 years ago, China-Syria relations have maintained healthy and stable development. Ning added before stressing that President Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders will meet with Assad to exchange in-depth views on bilateral relations and issues of common concern. Assad arrived in the eastern city of Hangzhou earlier on Thursday, leading a high-level political and diplomatic delegation. He is expected to meet with President Xi, who will hold a welcome banquet and conduct bilateral activities on Friday before attending the opening ceremony of the Asian Games on Saturday. This marks Assad's first official visit to Beijing since 2004, 4 years after he became president. It was the first time a Syrian head of state visited China since the two nations formed diplomatic relations in 1956. The relationship between Damascus and Beijing has markedly improved over the past several years. Since 2020, China, alongside Russia, started using their veto power at the UN Security Council to prevent Western intervention in the Arab country's internal affairs. And last year, Chinese and Syrian officials signed a memorandum of understanding welcoming Damascus into the Belt and Road Initiative, a mega infrastructure project that seeks to bring capital and infrastructure to global South countries while dramatically strengthening connectivity for commerce, finance, and culture. Hopefully, this opens up an opportunity for China to begin putting some money into Syria, making some serious investments, because it's going to take hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild the country after the proxy war, which killed something around 500,000 people. And right now, of course, the economic war is devastating the country. We know from the UN that 90% of the people in Syria live below the poverty line with limited access to food and water and electricity and fuel, and healthcare and transportation. And the U.S. occupation is where the American troops and their Kurdish allies are controlling, and the contractors are in control of most of the oil and the wheat resources. And of course, Israel's always bombing the country every week. And so it's just a devastating situation. Hopefully, China is willing to just, bypass the sanctions and just go ahead and start rebuilding the country. But that could still be a ways away. But hopefully this is some progress toward that end.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for the update. And everybody, we will be back with more shows next week. Keep an eye on the Institute. Me and Connor have been doing a lot of writing in the news section, but tons of great content at the